Of the time, you're right 50% of the time.
You gotcha. Yeah.
Two. We can go ahead and get a seat now. We're going to go ahead and get started with our Sunday School Hour. In this hour, we're going to do an interview with Brother Woody. But before we do that, there's a video that presents a little bit more about what he received the Medal of Honor for and a little more background on that. And so we're going to go ahead and show that first. It's about 6 minutes long. And then after that, we'll be, Brother Al Roberts and I will be asking some questions. But we may, as we have time, open it up for questions from you as well. So if you want to be thinking about that, if there's something that you would like to ask him, you can do that also. But we'll go ahead and start at this time with the video.
I had been in the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was my first experience to pre-military, if you will. They were a little bit military. The Civilian Conservation Corps was regulated by the Army, but we worked in civilian jobs off the Army base. And I had been in there for about a year and a half when Pearl Harbor happened. And I, along with a lot of other Americans, thought, well, if our country is threatened and we're going to lose our freedom, then we're going to go fight. So I requested my release from the Civilian Conservation Corps and went home to enlist in the Marine Corps.
To a young man eager to defend his country, the bitter fighting against the Japanese on the island of Iwo Jima must have seemed a hell out of all proportion to duty. But as a Marine demolition operator, Corporal Herschel Williams carried with him a hell of his own, a terrible weapon capable of evening the odds in one of the war's bloodiest engagements.
When we got to Iwo Jima, they told us that we probably would never even get off ship because we were a reserve division. The other two divisions had roughly 20,000 people in each, making 40,000 Marines that were going to be on that wee little island. So they had no idea they would ever need us. After they lost something like 5,000 on the first day, we decided they were going to have more people. One of the reasons that Iwo was so terrible, the Japanese had airfields there that they had built, and the airfields had been protected by reinforced concrete pillboxes. And they had used a lot of steel in those so that bombs could not break them up. They had piled a lot of sand on each top so that when the bomb hit or the artillery hit or whatever, it would blow a lot of sand in a lot of directions, but it didn't do much for the pillbox. So the pillboxes had us stalled. And as we were trying to get across that airfield, we were losing Marines very rapidly. And sometimes even commanding officers get desperate. So losing men rapidly, he asked me if I thought I could do anything about those pillboxes that were out there. Somebody in my unit said, I'll try. Now maybe I did say that. Sounds like me, you know, but I don't know whether I said that or not. But anyway, he assigned me some 4 rifle people, and they were to give me protection while I was out there trying to knock out some of those pillboxes. I hadn't been out there very long, and as I have said many, many times, it's almost like a dream, like it's really not real. 2 of those men, the automatic riflemen, of course, were like me. They were good targets. If a guy is shooting with an automatic weapon, the enemy would like to get him first. In the early part of the 4 hours that I was trying to do this job, I lost him. But the other 2 guys, they kept working with me, and one of them particularly, he kept pretty close to me to try to keep the Japanese off of me. And one of those pillboxes I'd been trying to reach, I saw where they had been firing their weapons. They didn't have any smokeless ammunition. Ours wasn't total, but it was better than theirs. So smoke was curling up out of the top of it, and I sort of figured they had a breathing hole up there or something, you know. So I crawled around to the side where they couldn't see me because one side of the pillbox was solid, and got up on top. And they had a air vent pipe up there, and it was just the right size that my flamethrower nozzle fit down in it. So I was ready to fire. And they knew that, I guess, because they came charging out of that pillbox. I don't know, 4 or 5 of them. I don't know. A bunch, anyway, with their weapons and bayonets to get me. And I got them first. I was just reading recently where flamethrower goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. They didn't work quite like ours, but they had them. And they were just as vicious then as they are, or were then. Its effectiveness was that once it hit its target, it burned all the oxygen out of the air. Lungs collapsed and people were gone. It was a terrible, terrible weapon. Don't ask me how I did it. I don't know how I did it. But in 4 hours, I knocked out 7 of those things. Much of it I don't remember. And I attribute that to fear. Absolutely. Once you got in behind the pillboxes, well, then we had the advantage. So in getting those 7 pillboxes out of the way, that, according to my citation, opened the lane that enabled us to go on through. When I received the Medal of Honor, the day after President Truman presented it, I went in the office of the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. And I can't tell you which place I was more frightened, standing before the President or facing the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Because he was almost God in the Marine Corps. He was also a Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal. So he knew what we were facing. But he said to me, as I stood there, very sternly, that medal does not belong to you. He said it belongs to all the Marines who did not get to come home. And don't ever do anything that would tarnish that medal. The medal represents what the country has always stood for: sacrifice. The day I was born, on October the 2nd, 1923, I was handed a gem that is absolutely impossible to buy. That was my freedom. Can't pay for it. There's not enough money in the world. So this medal, to me, stands for sacrifice and service.
Okay, so that gives you a little bit of the story of his citation, what happened, maybe a little background at Iwo Jima. As I mentioned last night, if you have an opportunity this week, take time to Google Iwo Jima and look at some of the newsreels from back then and understand a little bit more about what the battle was like. It was one of the major battles of World War II. 70,000 Marines landed on Iwo Jima, the largest amphibious assault, and 1/3 of them were killed in action. But Woody, we appreciate you being with us, and we appreciate your service. I want to thank you again for both. And we're going to take just a few moments to ask you some questions if we can. Last night you told us a little bit about your where you're from and your family and your upbringing. Can you share a little bit more on that for us just for a couple of moments?
Yes, I was born way out in the country, and it was a very small community, a little place called Quiet Dell. It was misnamed. It should have been Nosy Dell or something. But we were a very small community, and mostly farm community. Those that did not have a farm or did not work a farm in our area, they worked in the coal mines. And those were about the only occupations that we had. My family had a dairy farm, so I grew up on a dairy farm. where we had to milk the cows twice a day. Never did figure that out. Why couldn't we do it once a day? The cow didn't like that, so we had to do it twice a day, just to please her. And our work ethic was naturally, since you had animals that you had to take care of and had to do the milking twice a day and all of that, it was one of those things that ran 7 days, almost 24 hours a day. The summertime particularly, you would work every light hour that you could, because we didn't have lights of any kind that we could use for nighttime stuff. So everything had to be done during the day. We bottled milk in glass bottles with a little paper lid in the top. And we started off, or my dad started off, with a Model T Ford. And we would load that little Model T down with everything that we could get on it and take it to town 7 miles away and deliver milk and butter and eggs and whatever people would want, house to house in the community. During the summer months, we younger kids, we would go in the truck, and as soon as we hit town, back in those days we had running boards on automobiles and trucks, so we'd stand out on the running board, and my folks knew what house got a quart of milk or 2 quarts of milk or a pint of cream or whatever, and they would tell us what to take, and we'd run, set it on the porch or on the stoop or on the step, run back, grab the empty bottles that they had set out for us, and we'd take those back to the truck and deliver to all the customers that we had. The customers, I was trying to think of how we got our customers. The customers would leave notes in the milk bottle that if they were having family for Thanksgiving or Christmas or a holiday, May the 30th, then they would order more stuff because families are coming in to visit, and they'd leave us a note in the milk bottle. Bring me 2 quarts of milk instead of 1, and that type thing, and that's how we got our business. But I did that all my growing up years until I was about 16, and then I jumped to Hoop. Went to CCCs.
I want to say thank you so much for being here as well, Brother Woody. It's a real honor to be in the presence of greatness as yourself. So thank you so much for all you've done. Wonderful just being here with you. And on that note of families, as you just talked about, we are Ohana Baptist Church. And Ohana obviously is Hawaiian for family. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about your wife, Ruby, how you met, and some about your children, if you don't mind.
Sure. I had resigned my job and enlisted into the Marine Corps, but we had a 2-month waiting period because they were going in so rapidly. We only had 2 Marine boot camps in the country, Parris Island and San Diego. So they were getting so many people coming in, they couldn't handle them. They couldn't find drill instructors and housing and that type thing. So everybody east of the Mississippi was supposed to go to Parris Island for their boot camp. And the other way, they went to San Diego. But Parris Island was getting more people from the East Coast than the West Coast was, so they began sending troop trains from the south, down somewhere in Florida, Georgia, that area. They would come up through every state, and they would pick up 5 or 6 people that were going into the Marine Corps, and we ended up in California. So I became a Hollywood Marine. I'd never even heard of Hollywood, didn't even know it existed. But while I was waiting this 2-month period of time, I was out of a job. Had a boyhood school friend that worked for a cab company, cab bus company. And I called Victor and I said, Vic, I need something to do. I need to earn some money. I'll sweep the floor, wash the buses, or whatever you want me to do, but I need some money. So he said, well, let me see if I can't get you a job driving cab, because they were losing cab drivers who were going into the military. And you had to be 21 years of age to drive a public conveyance, and I am not 21. I am 18. And Vic said, that's a little problem, but we'll work that out. And the next thing I knew, I had a driver's license that showed I was 21 years old. I don't know where he got it, but I had it anyway. Those days we didn't take photos. There were no photos on the driver's license. And so I began driving cab. And our procedure was we would sit at a pole with a phone on it. The cab office would ring the phone and tell you where to go to pick up somebody or deliver something, or go to the Western Union office and pick up telegrams. And while I was doing that, I received a number of calls in the evening, because they put me on 6 to 6, 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. And the War Department at that time were releasing telegrams to the families in those communities that had lost a loved one. And they released them late in the afternoon, so they came into the Western Union office late in the evening, and they were on ticker tape, so they'd take the ticker tape and paste it to a telegram sheet, put it in a War Department envelope like it was coming from the War Department, and then they would call the cab office and say, we have a telegram to be delivered to such and such a residence. And they'd call us, we'd go to the Western Union office, we'd take the telegram to the home. I delivered a number of those as an 18-year-old to families that had just lost a loved one, and that was their only notice. They didn't get any telephone calls, nothing except that telegram. And I delivered those to mothers and widows, and it was had a tremendous impact on my life that never went away. But while I was doing that, my wife was a bookkeeper for an auto parts house. She had graduated high school, went to business college, and she could take shorthand and add some figures together. So every once in a while they'd do inventory, and she'd have to work over, and buses are gone. Very few automobiles. So I'm sitting at the cab stand, and she came up and asked me if I could take her to a little town of Meadowdale, which was only about 5 miles away. Certainly, she got in the back seat. I don't know that we ever said a word from there to home, but anyway, I took her to her home and collected the fee and went back to work. So a few days later, she came again. Well, I got a little more brass. I said, why don't you sit up front with me? And she agreed. So then we began getting conversation, and eventually it resulted in our began dating. We had no cars. And, you walked wherever you went. She lived 5 miles that way. I lived 7 miles that way. And many times I would go out there for an evening date. Couldn't go anywhere. We didn't have a car. So we'd sit on the porch and swing and neck and all that stuff. And then I would walk home. It wasn't unusual at all. I'd walk home. So I'm walking 12 miles to get home, and that wasn't unusual. We walked everywhere we went, so what's the difference, But if I may, I'll tell you a story that is really heart-rending, because I lost one of the very best friends I have ever had in my life on Iwo Jima. She came, I went out one night for a date, and she had gone to the G.C. Murphy 10-cent store, and she had bought a little ring, and her name was Ruby. So she had bought this little ring that had a wee tiny ruby in it. It was a little bigger than a pinhead, but it wasn't as big as a pea. So somewhere between. But she gave me, she knowing that I'm going into the Marine Corps, she gave me that ring and she said, I want you to wear this ring and every time you look at it, you think of me. Now, I didn't know anything about psychology, but it worked. When I'd think I'm going to go out on a date, there's that ring staring back at me. So we were engaged all the time I was in the military. A fellow by the name of Vernon Waters from a little town of Floyd, Montana, way up next to the Canadian border. He was a 6'6" giant, 13-shoe, big guy, but gentle. And Vernon became my flamethrower assistant. I carried the flamethrower that weighed 70 pounds. He carried everything else that belonged to him and me. My pack, my bedroll, my extra ammunition, my grenades, my everything. And so he became my assistant. When he left for the military, his dad had given him a ring. Now, Vernon's family were very unusual in that they were all big, but their fingers, middle fingers, were growing together. They could separate them a little. And they wanted to correct those when we were in boot camp, and Vernon just absolutely said no, because his brothers were like that, his dad was like that, and they had sisters, but they weren't. So Vernon, when we got overseas, became my assistant, and we're sitting in the tent one day talking, no doubt, about home and that sort of thing. And he had his ring that he had to wear on this finger because these fingers were growing together. Back in my day, a man did not wear a ring on that finger. So he took a lot of ribbing because of the ring on that finger, but it was a big ring that had a scene in it of a lake and trees around it that his daddy had given him. So we're sitting on the bunk and we made a pact. We shook hands. My day, when you shook hands with somebody and agreed to something, it was a bond. You didn't break that. You didn't break that. So we shook hands and said, if anything happens to me, you get this ring back to Ruby and get his ring back to Dad. Okay? That's the way it is. You know, in war, it's a court-martial offense if you take something off of a body of a comrade. You just don't do that. On March the 6th, we were attacking, and I had jumped into or slid into kind of a hole to get some protection and behaving myself. And I got hit with a piece of shrapnel, and I called the corpsman, he came and treated me and extracted the shrapnel and, in fact, gave it to me. I still have it. But as I was lying there, Vernon came running by me, trying to advance, and a knee mortar that the Japanese used, they had fired one of those and it hit him dead center in the top, and it killed him instantly. I jumped up and ran to him to see if he was still alive, and he was not, but he was stretched out on the ground, and here's this ring. And I remembered that pact. I tried to pull it off, and I couldn't. It just wouldn't come off. So I spit on it and finally worked it off. And we had been overseas almost 3 years at that time, and sunshine had never hit under that ring. It was as white as your uniform and just shined like a light, and I thought, somebody's going to know. Somebody took something off of that finger. So I grabbed some sand and rubbed on it, and that didn't do much, so I spit and made some mud and put that on it. That helped. And I stuck the ring in my pocket and went on in combat. And of course, they came and got Vernon and took him back. After the war, I wrote to the folks while I was still overseas saying I had the ring, but I was not going to mail it for fear that somebody would be able to get it. I will bring it to you when I get home. So I got home in November 1945, and in January 1946, no money. I had $300 mustering out pay that they gave me when I got discharged, but I had no money, no car. My wife, I had married in October, so our plan was we're going to ride a bus from West Virginia all the way to wherever it is. We had no idea where it was, but to deliver that ring, because I felt obligated to do that. But I had a friend who had a dealership, Dodge dealership, and he had an old 1942 Dodge convertible, red, and he agreed to let me drive that thing from West Virginia to Montana. Didn't have any tires on it. They were all bald, had a couple flat tires on the way, but we made it. And I delivered that ring to that dad. And you would have thought I was delivering the most precious thing in the world. It was, because it was part of her.
Sharing that with us. And you also have 2 children
$2.
and grandchildren?
I got 5 big, ugly grandchildren.
And any
All boys. One of them
One
back
right
there. And they're all about his size. We fed them very well.
Any great-grandchildren?
And then I have 2 great-grandsons, yes.
Okay. Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor, and what did you think at that point?
I was in a little town called Whitehall, Montana. Yeah, I did the same thing when I got there. What is this? You know, it was just a wide place in the prairie, and the town consisted primarily of a saloon and a general store. And the general store, you could buy anything in the world there that anybody would ever need. And the saloon, they were across the road from each other. There was no such thing as a paved road, but they were dirt, and they were across the road from each other. And we kids at 17 and 18, we were not allowed in the saloon because you had to be 21. But in that saloon, we finally got a tour of it during the day hours before they opened. And on the right side when you walked in were the cattle bar. That's where all the cattlemen went, and it had the brass rail and the spittoons and all that stuff those days. And then on the left side were the sheep herder side. And when they went in that saloon, cattlemen went that way and sheep herders went that way. And they had absolutely nothing to do with each other. And we, on a Saturday night, that was kind of our entertainment. We didn't have any other. Several of us would go over and sit on the porch of the general store across from the saloon, because we knew sooner or later there's going to be a fight come out those front doors. And sure enough, there somebody would get upset with somebody. And you know, in those days we didn't shoot each other; they fist cuffed it, you know, and come out and somebody'd take a whipping and they'd go back in. It was a good entertainment. But I was in Whitehall when they called us out on the 8th and told us that Pearl Harbor had been, that basically America had been bombed, mentioning Pearl Harbor, which none of us knew anything about, never heard tell of. And there were about 265 young men in that CC's camp. And they offered us an opportunity that if we wanted to go straight into the Army, since the Army ran the Civilian Conservation Corps, we could if we were over 18. If we're under 18, and I was, you'd have to have parent consent. Or you could take your, tear up your contract, go home for the purpose of going in the military. And that's what I selected to do because I wanted to wear that beautiful Marine Corps uniform instead of that ugly Army uniform.
We're starting to get close to the end here, but of this hour, I could literally sit here and listen to your stories all day long. I almost want to just get on your lap and just listen, you know, but that would be extremely disrespectful. So I'm not doing that. I'm holding myself back. One thing I was curious about as we were coming up with questions for you,
Thank you.
the day you've mentioned, I didn't know there was a South Pacific. I didn't know there was an East China Sea. I didn't know that there was a Japan. I didn't know there was a Pearl Harbor. Then there you were, at the White House, meeting President Truman. Tell us about that. How was that day for you?
Well, I was on Guam when I received orders to come back to the States. When I was notified, they came by and picked me up in a Jeep, a driver did, and took me to General Erskine's headquarters, who was the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Division. I had no idea why I was going there. I was frightened because you don't go to the general's house, you know. But when I got there, there was a colonel, by the way, standing out in the yard, and he gave me a briefing to how I should act and how I should act when I went inside the general's house. And he told me that I should walk up to the desk, stand at attention, and wait until he tells me what to do. Naturally, that's what I did. And when I did that, he gave me at ease, and then he began to tell me that I was being called back to the States. If he used the term Medal of Honor, it didn't register because that's like saying to me 10 years ago, cyberspace. I wouldn't have had any idea what you were talking about, and I wouldn't have had any idea what he was talking about because I'd never heard of it, had no idea what it was or why I was even receiving it. So he gave me then a set of, an envelope, great big yellow envelope with a wax seal on the flap. And that wax seal was about the size of a 50-cent piece. And in the middle of it, it had the letter E. And his name was Erskine, so that was his official seal. And then did inform me, do not open this envelope until you get to Hawaii. And I went back out, got in the Jeep, and they took me to the little unpaved airport that they had there on Guam, and to see if I could get me on an airplane to fly me back to the States. I had a reporting date that I had to be in Washington on October the 3rd, and this is on September the 15th, so time frame is pretty close. And I fly to Hawaii, have no idea where I landed except at an airport, and the kind Navy, they couldn't find me a seat on an aircraft because at that moment in time, we were bringing the Japanese American prisoners of war out of Japan, heading them to the United States. So they had first priority, as they should have, on every aircraft that was available. And there were not many available. So when I got to Hawaii, there was no plane available. So they sent me out to a Navy base and lost me for 7 days. Yeah. Finally, I wandered back into the headquarters of the Marine Corps because I was out there for 7 days and didn't know anybody and couldn't talk to anybody and couldn't do anything. And then they got me on a plane. One of the most vivid images in my mind that have never left. When I got aboard that aircraft that night, well, actually morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, there were 49 Americans on there that had been prisoners of war, the Japanese, from 5 years to less. But they didn't look human. Those guys that had weighed 160, 70 pounds now weighed 70, 80, and 90 pounds. And they really looked like a vision I have never seen and hope to never again. But it was one of the happiest group of people I have ever seen in my life. And they celebrated all the way from Hawaii to Frisco. But I'll never forget that scene. And I've had, since then, a tremendous admiration for people who suffered as a prisoner of war. There's nothing like it. When I got home, I got to Frisco. They reduced my airplane ticket to a train. It took 5 days from California to West Virginia on train in those days. And we started across country. And that train from Chicago to Washington, they had changed trains at Chicago. From Chicago to Washington, that train had a gentleman on it. He was a Southern general, and he dressed like the Southern generals did in the Civil War period. He had the boots and the big hat and all of that paraphernalia. And I was sitting in the club car drinking a cup of coffee, and he came by and sat down and talked to me and asked me where I was going, why I was going, and all that. I told him. But I was headed to Washington. I would have had to go to Washington and then from Washington back home if I got back home. And he said, just wait a minute, I'll be back. So in a little while he came back with the conductor. And the conductor sat down and talked to him, and he said, we don't stop at Connellsville, Pennsylvania. That's not a train stop. But he said, if we slow this thing down to about 3 miles an hour, do you think you could get off of it? You bet your dollar I can get off of it. So at Connellsville, they slowed down, and I'm standing on the step, and they got down to about 3 miles an hour, and I jumped off. And at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 29th of September, I knocked on the door of my word we didn't know then, fiancée. It was my girlfriend. I knocked on her door at 7 o'clock in the morning. They had no idea that I was home or where I was, but there was no communication back at that time. Everything called long distance, we called. But when I got to the White House, there were 13 of us, and we're alphabetical. I'm next to last. A guy named Zimmer is last. I'm next to last. And they read the citation of why you're receiving the Medal of Honor. Then somebody hands the president the medal to put around your neck. So the program went on and on and on forever, I thought. And all the time I'm getting more shaky and nervous. Walking up to the President of the United States, standing next to him, my body would not be still. I am shaking and I couldn't control it. I tried every way I knew, standing on my toes and standing on my heels, but it wouldn't, I couldn't do it. After he put the ribbon around my neck, he laid his hand on my left shoulder. And I think it was to keep me from jumping out of my shoes, but he made the statement to me, as he made to the others in various ways. I would rather have this medal than to be president. A day I will never, ever forget.
Appreciate you sharing with us just in the moment or so we have left. You've shown great emotion in sharing some of these incidents and sees you can still affect you in many ways.
Yes, sir.
And so I'd like to ask you in closing this time if you could share with us maybe a humorous story about your time in the Marine Corps and being deployed.
Yeah. While we were overseas, the only money that we could send home was equivalent to whatever pay we received for the month. You could send that much back home, but anything else you couldn't. So I had accumulated a little bit of money, a few dollars, I don't know, $75 or $80. And that was a lot of money back in those days, really was. But we wanted to have a Christmas party. Our group, our tent group, there were 6 of us to a tent. And of course, tents were all lined up side by side. So 3 or 4 tents of us, we wanted to have a Christmas party. But we were getting 2 cans of warm beer a week. 3% stuff. Yeah. So most of the guys that didn't like warm beer, you could sell it for $1 to somebody else that was willing to pay $1 for a warm beer. And you always find suckers wherever you go. So that basically is what I was doing with mine. That's how I accumulated this little bit of money that I had. And so finally they decided, well, you can't have Christmas unless you have whiskey. I don't know where that came from, but they delegated me to find a 5th of whiskey. I'm the guy that's going to have to find it. Well, we knew the officers had it in officers' country, but we were not allowed to go there. Right? So, yet we knew that the Navy guys from the ships were coming ashore bringing 5th of whiskey that they were selling to the officers. We weren't allowed to have it. We were forbidden. But we knew that. So I thought, well, the best way I can get a 5th of whiskey is go to the officers' edge of the officers' country and wait until one of those Navy guys come by. Yeah. So I did. I went up there and I waited and I waited and I waited. Finally, here come a Navy guy and he had 2 5ths of whiskey. I paid $50 for a 5th of whiskey. And then I wish I'd have killed myself because I got sick.
All right. Well, I appreciate you sharing with us at this time, and I hope that's been interesting for you as well. I wish we'd had more time if we could have opened it up to questions, but what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do this next Sunday school as well. There's some more questions that we have. We want to ask them. I do want to give you an opportunity to do that, and so we'll look forward to that. And but right now, let's go ahead and stand for dismissing word of prayer from the Sunday School Hour, and then we'll take a short break until our service starts right after that, if we can. Brother Roberts, would you dismiss us in prayer, please?
Let's pray. Father, we are humbled and grateful that on this Lord's Day, that we can be here at Ohana Baptist Church, spending time with a hero of our nation. And not just a hero, but a man who is full of humility and honor and grace and thankfulness to the Creator of the universe. And we're thankful that we can be in your presence as well. And Father, we just pray now that the things we've heard would make us stand a little taller today. Not because we've deserved anything, but because you are a great God who loves us and gives us opportunities like these day in and day out. May we use this as a way to reach others around the world. We ask it in Jesus' precious and lovely name. Amen.